Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive headfirst, or perhaps head gently onto a velvet cushion, into the wonderfully peculiar world of Victorian etiquette. Imagine, if you will, that you're in a dimly lit drawing room somewhere in London, around, say, 1888. The gaslights softly hiss, casting long, dancing shadows on the heavy draperies. You're wearing something rather stiff, perhaps a corset that feels more like a gentle hug from a particularly unyielding oak tree, or a waistcoat that insists on formal posture. The air is thick with the scent of polished mahogany and perhaps a faint hint of lavender from someone's potpourri bowl. You hear the distant clatter of a carriage on cobblestones, a sound that, curiously, seems to lull you into a state of contented stillness. You're ready for a nice, relaxing evening, maybe a cup of tepid tea and a quiet chat. But oh, how wrong you might be. Because in this meticulously ordered universe, the most serene moments could be fraught with invisible perils. One wrong glance, one misplaced word, or perhaps, most surprisingly, one ignored friend, and your entire social standing could simply evaporate. You probably would unsurvive a single week in Victorian society without inadvertently committing a grave social faux pas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our gentle exploration begins with a concept that, to our modern sensibilities, might seem utterly counterintuitive to the very idea of friendship: the deliberate act of ignoring someone you know, not out of malice, not out of forgetfulness, but out of a precise, unspoken, and often devastatingly effective adherence to the intricate dance of Victorian social hierarchy. You see, the Victorian era, spanning roughly from 1837 to 1901, was a time obsessed with order, decorum, and the subtle communication of status. Every gesture, every utterance, every piece of clothing, and yes, even every act of non-recognition carried a weight of meaning that we, in our jeans and t-shirts, can barely fathom. Think of it as a complex, slow-motion ballet where every movement, or lack thereof, told a story. And one of the most powerful stories you could tell was that you simply didn't see someone, even if they were standing right in front of you. This wasn't about being rude in the way we understand it today. It was about operating within a rigid system of social cues, where acknowledging the wrong person, or the right person at the wrong time, could have far-reaching consequences. It was a social battlefield fought with averted gazes and unreturned bows, far more potent than any shouted insult. Historians still argue whether this elaborate system was primarily a means of social control for the elite, or a practical framework for navigating an increasingly complex urban society. Imagine you are a respectable, though perhaps not outrageously wealthy, member of the upper middle class in London. You've just arrived at a rather fashionable gathering, perhaps an afternoon tea or a garden party. The air is filled with the murmur of polite conversation, the gentle clinking of teacups, and the faint scent of roses. You spot someone you know, perhaps an acquaintance from your morning strolls in Hyde Park, or someone whose sister you met at a rather dull charity bazaar. Your instinct, naturally, is to offer a polite nod, a small smile, a customary greeting. But then you pause, you remember the rules. Is this person of your exact social standing? Are they currently engaged in conversation with someone of higher rank? Has there been some recent, perhaps unspoken, social tremor that has shifted their position, even slightly? If you acknowledge them inappropriately, you might not just embarrass yourself, but implicitly elevate them, or, far worse, implicitly lower yourself. And so you execute it, the cut. Not a dramatic turn of the head, not a disdainful sniff, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of focus. Your gaze drifts past them, perhaps fixing on a distant chandelier or a particularly interesting pattern on the wallpaper. Your smile, if it was there, fades just a fraction. You are present, yet absent, your vision conveniently blurred in their direction. It's a social disappearing act, performed right in front of their very eyes. The beauty, or perhaps the terrifying genius of this maneuver, lies in its ambiguity. Did you really not see them? Or did you choose not to? The victim of the cut is left in a silent agony of doubt, replaying the moment in their mind, searching for their perceived transgression. It was a weapon more refined and often more effective than any direct insult, because it left the target to inflict the pain upon themselves through self-recrimination. It was a gentle, yet brutal, form of social warfare. This subtle art of the social cut wasn't merely a spontaneous reaction. It was a highly refined, almost theatrical performance, honed through years of observation and strict adherence to societal norms. You see, it wasn't enough to simply not acknowledge someone. The execution mattered. A blatant stare that then deliberately drifted away was considered crude. The true master of the cut would offer a fleeting, almost ghost-like glance, just enough to register presence, before their eyes gently, almost imperceptibly, moved on. It was like a whisper of recognition that immediately faded into the background hum of polite society. The victim would be left wondering if they'd imagined the initial flicker, or if the slight had been intentional. This ambiguity was key. It prevented a direct confrontation, yet inflicted a deeper wound of uncertainty and perceived unworthiness. Imagine the recipient of such a cut. They might feel a flush creeping up their neck, a sudden tightness in their chest. They'd replay the moment endlessly, questioning their outfit, their last conversation, their very existence, searching for the fatal flaw that had led to their social exile. It was psychological warfare, played out with minimal physical movement. This concept of the cut wasn't just about general acquaintances. It extended to more intimate relationships as well. If, for instance, you had a falling out with a close friend, or if a scandal touched someone in your immediate circle, you wouldn't necessarily engage in a dramatic public argument. Oh no, that would be far too gauche, far too un-Victorian. Instead, the relationship would simply cease to exist in public. You might pass your former confidant in the street, or even at a large gathering, and your eyes would simply glide past them as if they were a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture. No nod, no smile, no acknowledgement of shared history. It was as if they had simply faded from the social fabric, a ghost in a drawing room full of living, breathing, and awkwardly silent people. This, for many, was a far more painful experience than a heated exchange. Historians still argue whether this pervasive use of social ostracism contributed to the era's reputation for repressed emotions, or provided a necessary mechanism for maintaining order in a rapidly expanding society. Consider the ripple effect of such an action. If you cut someone, others might take notice. Was it a signal that this person was now persona non grata? Society, in its curious, self-regulating way, would often follow suit, like a flock of well-dressed sheep politely ignoring a stray. The cut, therefore, could act as a social death sentence, silently enforced by the collective. It was a subtle, yet powerful, mechanism for maintaining the strict boundaries of class and propriety. Think of it as a silent alarm bell ringing only in the ears of the socially astute, signaling that someone had fallen from grace without a single word being uttered. You might even find yourself in the awkward position of having to choose sides in a social feud, simply by not acknowledging one party while gracefully acknowledging the other. It was a minefield where every step was laden with potential social explosives. One mainstream historical fact to anchor us in this fascinating era is the sheer volume of etiquette manuals published during the Victorian period. Books like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management or Etiquette for Ladies and Gentlemen weren't just advice columns. They were essential survival guides for navigating the labyrinthine social landscape. They meticulously detailed everything from how to address a duke to the correct way to hold a teacup, and, crucially, the precise circumstances under which one might avoid acknowledging an acquaintance. These manuals served as a sort of social Bible, guiding people through the intricate rituals of daily life, and providing the unspoken rules of engagement that governed every interaction. If you were a new arrival to London society, or aspiring to climb the social ladder, these books were your Rosetta Stone to understanding the baffling nuances of polite behavior. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that highlights the lengths to which Victorians went to avoid awkward encounters. Some particularly anxious individuals were known to plot their walking routes through parks or down streets with almost military precision, attempting to predict and preempt any potential undesirable run-in. Imagine you're planning your afternoon constitutional, not just considering the weather or the scenic views, but meticulously mapping out which paths to take to ensure you don't accidentally cross paths with Mrs. Higgins, whom you recently learned had been rather scandalous at the last assembly. It was a form of social cartography, where the landscape was dotted with potential social hazards, and the goal was to navigate around them with supreme stealth and grace. One might even pretend to be deeply engrossed in a book or a particularly interesting cloud formation, anything to justify not seeing someone approaching. It was a silent ballet of avoidance, performed daily on the public stage. And this brings us back to the core of the paradox. In a society so obsessed with polite interaction, the act of not interacting became one of its most potent forms of communication. It was a world where silence spoke volumes, and absence of recognition was a deafening roar. You were expected to be seen, but also to know when not to see. It's enough to make one long for the simpler, if perhaps louder, days of shouting at your friends across the street. Stepping from the subtle battlefield of the cut, we now turn our attention to the seemingly innocuous, yet profoundly powerful, instrument of Victorian social warfare, the calling card. You might imagine a calling card as a simple business card, a mere formality for exchanging contact information. Oh, how delightfully naive you'd be. In Victorian society, these small, often elaborately printed pieces of pasteboard were the very keys to the kingdom, or, conversely, the brick walls that kept you out. They dictated who you could visit, when you could visit, and most importantly, who was permitted to even consider visiting you. It was a silent, paper-based symphony of social power. Imagine, if you will, that you're a Victorian lady, impeccably dressed, bonnet just so, parasol at a jaunty yet appropriate angle. You wish to pay a social call. You don't simply knock on the door and ask if Mrs. Whoever is home. Perish the thought. Instead, you dispatch your footman, or, if you're feeling particularly daring, you might even deliver it yourself, a crisp calling card. This card, however, isn't just your name. It's a coded message. If you left 2 cards, one for the lady of the house and one for her adult daughter, it signaled a desire to call on both. If you left a corner folded, it could mean you delivered it in person. And if you merely left a card without asking to be received, it was a polite way of saying, I made the effort, but I don't actually expect to see you. It was a delicate dance of intent and expectation, all communicated by a piece of paper barely larger than your palm. Now, here's where the cut and the delightful act of ignoring weaves its way back into the narrative. The return of a calling card was as significant as its initial delivery. If your card was returned, especially by post, it was a clear and unambiguous signal. Your visit was unwelcome, your presence undesired. This was the paper equivalent of a social cut, delivered with the impersonal efficiency of the postal service. No awkward eye contact, no muttered excuses, just the silent thud of rejection landing on your doormat. It was a polite, yet utterly devastating, form of social closure. Think of it as the original unfriend button, but with far more painful social consequences. You wouldn't just be unfriended, you'd be unpersoned, at least within that particular social circle. Historians still argue whether the elaborate rituals surrounding calling cards were primarily about maintaining class distinctions, or simply a practical way to manage the sheer volume of social interactions in a growing urban environment. Consider a quirkier aspect of calling card etiquette, the subtle art of leaving cards for someone not at home. If you called and the lady of the house was not at home, which often meant she simply wasn't receiving callers at that moment, rather than being literally absent, you would leave your card. This wasn't a wasted effort. It was a demonstration that you had fulfilled your social obligation to call, thereby placing the ball, or rather, the card, in their court. They were now obligated to return your call, or at least your card. If they failed to do so, it was a clear social slight, another form of the implied cut. It was a game of paper tennis, with social standing as the stakes. Imagine the intricate calculations involved. How many cards to leave, which corner to fold, whether to simply drop and run, or briefly inquire if the lady was receiving. It was a social performance, demanding meticulous attention to detail. One mainstream historical fact to underscore the importance of these paper emissaries: calling cards were often used as invitations to social events. Instead of a dedicated invitation card, a calling card with a handwritten note, like at home, Tuesday, 4 to 6 p.m., on it served as a perfectly acceptable invitation for informal gatherings. This highlights their multifaceted role, not just as tools of introduction or rejection, but as facilitators of social engagement. They were the original social network, connecting individuals through a tangible, highly regulated medium. If you weren't on someone's calling card list, you simply weren't part of their world. And for a quirky tidbit, some Victorian ladies kept elaborate calling card albums, where they would meticulously paste the cards they received, often adding notes about the caller, their social standing, and whether the call was returned. These weren't just scrapbooks. They were social ledgers, tracking the ebb and flow of their social currency. Imagine meticulously organizing your social life in a physical book, each entry a reminder of a past encounter, a future obligation, or a past rejection. It's almost quaint, isn't it? A far cry from our digital social feeds, but arguably far more impactful, given the tangible nature of the slight if your card wasn't accepted. It reminds you that even in an age of seemingly rigid formality, there was always room for a bit of domestic record-keeping, ensuring that no social slight, intentional or otherwise, went unnoted. Having navigated the treacherous waters of calling cards, we now drift gracefully into another cornerstone of Victorian social life, equally fraught with hidden perils: the morning call ritual. This wasn't a quick pop-in for a chat over coffee, nor was it a spontaneous, friendly visit. Oh no, the morning call was a meticulously choreographed performance, a delicate balance of social obligation and subtle power dynamics. It was, in essence, a formal social visit undertaken by ladies, typically between the hours of 2 and 5 p.m. A somewhat confusing nomenclature, as it clearly wasn't the morning for most folks, but perhaps the Victorians had a more leisurely concept of their day. Imagine you are Mrs. Higgins, impeccably attired, as always, making your round of calls. You arrive at the grand townhouse of Lady Pemberton. You don't simply knock. Your footman, if you have one, or you yourself, if you are a mere mortal without such luxuries, presents your calling card. Now, here's where the fun begins. Lady Pemberton might genuinely be not at home. Perhaps she's out visiting someone else, or attending a rather important bonnet fitting. In this case, you simply leave your card, and the social obligation is met. But more often not, at home was a polite fiction, a convenient shield. Lady Pemberton might be very much at home, perhaps sipping tea in her drawing room, but simply not receiving visitors. This was another subtle form of the cut, isn't it? A silent, elegant dismissal, delivered by a maid at the door. You're not being rejected personally, of course, just not received. It's a very important distinction, designed to save face for all involved. You might feel a slight prickle of disappointment, but you would never betray it. You simply nod, turn, and proceed to your next carefully planned destination. But what if Lady Pemberton was receiving? Then you were ushered in. You would be shown to the drawing room, a space designed for impressing, a testament to wealth and good taste, laden with velvet, potted palms, and perhaps an unsettling number of taxidermied birds. And here the clock began to tick. A morning call was expected to be brief, lasting no more than 10 to 15 minutes. Any longer, and you risked being perceived as tiresome, or worse, as overstaying your welcome, a true social sin. You would engage in polite, the latest fashionable gathering, the health of mutual acquaintances. Deep, meaningful discussions were generally avoided. This was about maintaining social connections, not bearing your soul. Historians still argue whether this strict time limit encouraged efficient social networking or simply promoted superficial relationships. One mainstream historical fact about these calls: it was considered extremely rude to call on someone more than once without receiving a return call. This was a clear sign that your calls were not desired, and to persist would be to invite explicit social ostracism. So, if you'd left your card twice for the same individual without a reciprocal visit or card, you quietly removed them from your calling list. It was a silent agreement of non-engagement, far more civilized, perhaps, than today's ghosting, but equally clear in its intent. You were politely informed that your presence wasn't quite desired, and you were expected to take the hint. Now, for a quirky little tidbit that adds to the gentle absurdity of it all, some Victorian ladies kept a small, delicate silver tray specifically for the collection of calling cards left by visitors. This tray wasn't just for holding paper. It was a visible display of their social standing and popularity. The more cards on the tray, the more socially active and desirable the household was perceived to be. Imagine a silent, gleaming trophy case of social triumphs. A sparsely populated tray, on the other hand, might whisper tales of social decline or unpopularity. It was a subtle signal to all who entered, a quiet declaration of one's place in the intricate social tapestry. You can almost hear the tiny whispers of judgment as a guest's eyes drifted across the various names, silently assessing, and the subtle humor in all this. The sheer effort expended to maintain these seemingly effortless social connections. You'd spend hours getting ready, travel across town, navigate the complexities of who was home and who wasn't, all for a 10-minute chat about the weather and a delicate exchange of polite nods. It's enough to make one want to simply stay home in one's dressing gown, isn't it? But then, of course, you'd risk falling out of the social loop entirely, and that, in Victorian society, was a fate arguably worse than politely ignoring your friends. From the subtle signaling of calling cards and the timed precision of morning calls, our Victorian journey now leads us to the very bedrock of social initiation, formal introductions and their perils. In an era where social circles were rigidly defined and breaking into a new one was akin to scaling a well-guarded fortress, a proper introduction wasn't just a nicety. It was a non-negotiable prerequisite for any future interaction. You simply didn't approach someone you hadn't been formally introduced to. Doing so was considered an unpardonable sin, a vulgar display of presumption that could instantly brand you as an outsider, forever beyond the pale. Imagine you're at a grand ball, perhaps at Almack's, the most exclusive of London's assembly rooms. The chandeliers sparkle, reflecting off polished floors, where couples glide in a waltz. You spot a dashing young gentleman across the room, or perhaps a lady whose wit has been the talk of society for weeks. Your modern impulse might be to simply walk over, offer a smile, and strike up a conversation. But hold your horses, dear friend. In the Victorian world, such an act would be met with an immediate, frosty glare and a swift turning of the back. You might as well have arrived in your nightshirt. You simply couldn't do it. Your social survival depended entirely on the intervention of a mutual acquaintance, someone who possessed the necessary social capital to bridge the gap between you and the object of your conversational desires. The rules for introductions were as intricate as the lace on a lady's gown. A gentleman was always introduced to a lady, never the other way around. A younger person was introduced to an older person. Someone of lower social standing was introduced to someone of higher standing. This wasn't just about politeness. It was a constant reinforcement of the social hierarchy, a gentle yet firm reminder of everyone's place. The introducer, often an older, more established woman, bore a significant responsibility. They were, in essence, vouching for your character, putting their own social reputation on the line. If you later proved to be a bore, or worse, a cad, their judgment would be questioned, and their own social standing might suffer a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor. Historians still argue whether these rigid introduction protocols fostered genuine respect or merely perpetuated superficial social stratification. And here's where the peril truly lies. A botched introduction could ruin your entire social season. Imagine the horror. If your introducer mumbled your name, or worse, forgot it entirely, you'd be left hovering awkwardly, a social phantom in the midst of a glittering crowd. Or perhaps they introduced you with a description that was less than flattering, implying a lack of pedigree or charm. These small missteps, often unintentional, could linger like a bad scent, subtly tainting your reputation and making future social acceptance an uphill battle. It was a high-stakes game, a verbal presentation, where every syllable counted. One mainstream historical fact to illustrate this point: the concept of vouching for an individual was paramount. When an introduction was made, it wasn't merely a naming of names, it was an implicit endorsement. You were, in essence, being rubber-stamped by someone reputable. This endorsement was critical for establishing trust and allowing new social connections to form. Without it, you remained an unknown quantity, a social cipher, unlikely to be welcomed into established circles. This formal validation prevented indiscriminate mingling and ensured that social networks remained largely within established boundaries. Now, for a quirky little tidbit that adds a dash of gentle humor to the formality. There was a very specific rule that once introduced, you were only permitted to speak to the newly introduced person after they had spoken to you. Imagine the silent standoffs. You've just been introduced to someone utterly fascinating, perhaps a celebrated poet or a daring explorer. Your mind is buzzing with witty remarks and insightful questions, but you must wait. You must simply stand there, perhaps offering a slight, expectant smile, until they deign to utter the first word. It was a test of patience, a silent battle of wills, and a wonderfully awkward barrier to spontaneous conversation. One can almost picture the internal monologue. Are they going to speak? Is my smile too wide? Have I blinked too much? It's enough to make one long for the simpler days of waving frantically across a crowded room. And the subtle irony in all this: a society that so heavily emphasized politeness often created situations of excruciating awkwardness through its own rigid rules. The very mechanisms designed to smooth social interaction often made it a minefield of potential blunders, where the fear of an improper introduction could lead to a night of silent, polite dread. Having gingerly navigated the social tightrope of introductions, we now step, or rather, very carefully, are seated at the Victorian dinner party. This wasn't merely a meal. It was a grand strategic operation, a social battlefield fought with forks and spoons, where the seating arrangement was the most powerful weapon in the hostess's arsenal. You see, the placement of each guest wasn't arbitrary. It was a meticulously planned declaration of social standing, a silent narrative unfolding before your very eyes, or rather, your elegantly averted gaze. Imagine you're the host, standing at the entrance to your dining room, surveying your guests. You have spent hours, perhaps days, poring over your seating plan, like a general plotting a military campaign. Who sits next to whom? Who requires separation due to a recent, hushed scandal? Who needs to be strategically placed to elevate the status of a rising social star, or gently diminish the perceived importance of another? Every detail mattered. The most honored guest, naturally, would be placed at the right hand of the host or hostess, a coveted position that whispered of prestige and importance. Further down the table, positions became less desirable, reflecting a subtle, yet undeniable, hierarchy. The concept of ignoring your friends, or at least strategically placing them, found its zenith here. You might genuinely like someone, consider them a dear companion, but if their social standing was lower than that of another guest you wished to impress, they would find themselves relegated to a less prominent seat. This wasn't personal. It was simply the unspoken rule of the social game. To place a less important person in a position of honor would be to insult your more distinguished guests, a social blunder far more egregious than a simple oversight. The hostess, in her infinite wisdom, was the conductor of this silent symphony of status. Historians still argue whether these rigid seating protocols stifled genuine conversation or simply ensured that important discussions happened between appropriate parties. Consider the subtle messages exchanged across the linen tablecloth. A guest seated too far down the table might subtly register the slight, perhaps feeling a pang of diminished importance, though they would never, ever let it show. A guest strategically placed might feel a quiet sense of triumph, a gentle affirmation of their rising star. It was a fascinating study in nonverbal communication, where the distance from the head of the table spoke volumes louder than any shouted proclamation. You might find yourself seated next to someone utterly dreadful, a notorious bore or a scandalous gossip, simply because their social standing dictated it, and you would smile, nod politely, and engage in the most excruciatingly dull conversation, all while internally screaming for deliverance. Such was the price of maintaining appearances. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the intricacies of dinner party etiquette: gentlemen were expected to escort ladies to the dining room and ensure they were seated before taking their own places. This was a fundamental act of chivalry and decorum, reinforcing gender roles and the structured nature of the event. The procession into the dining room was almost as important as the meal itself, a carefully choreographed parade of social order. If a gentleman failed to offer his arm, or offered it to the wrong lady, it could cause a ripple of quiet disapproval through the room. Now, for a quirky little tidbit that adds a dash of gentle absurdity to the whole affair. In larger, more formal dinners, guests were often assigned dinner partners for the evening, with whom they were expected to engage in conversation, at least during certain courses. Imagine receiving a discreet card before dinner, telling you who your designated conversational partner would be. You couldn't just float from person to person, engaging freely. Oh no, you were tethered to your assigned companion, for better or worse. This often led to incredibly awkward silences if personalities clashed, or forced attempts at polite conversation when all you really wanted to do was discuss the peculiar new species of fern you'd acquired. It was a controlled environment, where even your conversations were subtly managed. It's enough to make you long for a good old-fashioned potluck, where you can just sit wherever you please, isn't it? And the quiet joke in all of this, the immense amount of planning and covert manipulation that went into creating an evening that was supposed to appear utterly effortless and charming. Beneath the glittering surface of polite society, a veritable war room of social strategy was constantly in play, all to ensure that everyone knew their place, even if they had to be ignored to achieve it. Leaving the highly structured confines of the dinner table, we now turn our attention to a truly grand undertaking that often concluded, or perhaps initiated, many a Victorian's social trajectory: the grand tour and its intricate demands for social re-entry. This wasn't merely a vacation. It was an educational pilgrimage, a lengthy sojourn through the cultural capitals of Europe. designed to polish the rough edges of young aristocrats and wealthy gentry. You'd spend months, even years, immersing yourself in art, architecture, and languages, becoming, theoretically, a more cultured and worldly individual. But returning home after such an experience was unto simple matter of unpacking your trunks and regaling your friends with tales of Venetian gondolas. Oh no. Re-entering Victorian society after a grand tour required an almost as rigorous adherence to etiquette as the journey itself. Imagine you've just disembarked from a rather bumpy steamship, or perhaps a slightly less bumpy, though still interminable, train journey arriving back in London. You're brimming with new knowledge, perhaps a rather fashionable tan, and a newfound appreciation for Italian opera. Your immediate thought might be to reconnect with your old circle, to share your adventures. But hold on a moment. You couldn't just leap back into the social fray as if you simply popped out for a spot of tea. Your extended absence, no matter how edifying, had created a social void that needed to be carefully bridged. You had, in a sense, been out of sight, and therefore, potentially, out of mind. The primary mechanism for re-entry was the meticulously planned at-home day, or series of days. You, or more likely, your mother or wife, would send out special calling cards announcing your return and specifying certain hours when you would be at home to receive visitors. This was your formal reintroduction to society, your chance to be seen and to signal your renewed availability for social engagement. It was a crucial period, as missing these opportunities could lead to a slow, gentle social fade, where you simply ceased to be relevant to the ongoing social narrative. The art of ignoring played a subtle role here too. Those who truly wished to reconnect would attend, while those who deemed you no longer relevant, or perhaps harbored a quiet grudge, would simply not be at home themselves, or just fail to call. Historians still argue whether the Grand Tour primarily served as genuine cultural education or was merely a prolonged ritual of social display for the elite. Consider the gentle pressure of these initial re-entry interactions. You'd sit, perhaps, in your newly redecorated drawing room and receive a stream of polite callers. Each visitor would offer carefully phrased questions about your travels, expecting equally careful and modest replies. No oversharing, no boasting, and certainly no tales of any truly wild escapades you might have had in Paris. The goal was to smoothly reintegrate, to show you hadn't become too foreign, too bohemian during your adventures. It was a careful balance between showcasing your newfound sophistication and reassuring everyone that you were still fundamentally one of them. One mainstream historical fact about the Grand Tour: it was often considered a rite of passage for young aristocratic men, providing them with essential life experience and cultural polish before they entered politics or managed their estates. It wasn't merely leisure, it was a perceived necessity for proper gentlemanly development. While women sometimes undertook tours, especially accompanied by family, the classic Grand Tour was predominantly a male endeavor, steeped in the ideals of classical education and European refinement. Now, for a quirky tidbit that adds a touch of gentle irony to the whole experience, some returning Grand Tourists, in an attempt to subtly show off their newfound sophistication, would occasionally let slip a few foreign phrases into their conversation, or make references to obscure European artists that no one else in the room had ever heard of. This was a risky move. If done too overtly, it could be perceived as pretentious, and would likely result in polite, yet firm, social cuts from those who found such displays tiresome. The goal was to hint at your cosmopolitanism, not to bludgeon people with it. It was a delicate dance of intellectual one-upmanship performed with the utmost subtlety. You might, for example, casually mention a rather charming little cafe in Rome, instead of a coffee shop, hoping someone would catch the subtle linguistic flex. It's enough to make one sigh with gentle amusement, picturing these earnest attempts at cultural superiority and the quiet humor in all this. The immense effort involved in appearing effortlessly cultured and well-traveled. You spent years abroad, saw incredible sights, learned new things, only to return home and face a series of highly formal, slightly anxious social engagements designed to confirm that you hadn't gone to native. A grand tour might have expanded your mind, but its social re-entry certainly ensured you didn't expand beyond the bounds of acceptable Victorian behavior. From the anxieties of re-entry after a grand tour, we now turn our attention to an even more profound, yet equally ritualized, aspect of Victorian life: mourning etiquette and its rigid demands for social distance. Death, for the Victorians, was not merely a private sorrow. It was a highly public performance, governed by an incredibly complex web of rules and expectations. And within this elaborate performance, the act of ignoring or maintaining specific distances from others was paramount, not as a slight, but as a solemn mark of respect for the deceased and for the bereaved. Imagine you are a newly widowed lady in Victorian England. The world, as you knew it, has shattered. But even amidst your profound grief, society demands adherence to a strict code. Your clothing, first and foremost, would be a stark declaration of your status. You would enter deep mourning, characterized by heavy, dull black crepe, devoid of any ornamentation, often worn for a year and a day. This wasn't a fashion choice. It was a visible sign, a signal to all who beheld you that you were in a state of profound bereavement. And this visual signal, in turn, dictated how others interacted with you, or rather, how they didn't interact with you. The rules for interacting with someone in mourning were incredibly precise. You would not, for example, engage in light-hearted chatter or frivolous conversation. You would avoid inviting them to social gatherings, especially those centered around entertainment or gaiety. Your presence as a mourner effectively cast a solemn shadow in society. In its rigid understanding of decorum, acknowledged and respected that. This meant a period of enforced social isolation for the bereaved, a time when direct engagement was kept to a minimum, and formal condolences were offered with utmost gravity. Historians still argue whether these elaborate mourning rituals provided genuine comfort and a structured grieving process, or merely served as a public display of wealth and social standing. Consider the polite aversion, the averted gaze. When you encountered a mourner, especially someone in deep mourning, you wouldn't offer a cheerful greeting. You might offer a sympathetic, yet somber nod, or a quiet murmur of condolence, but never a prolonged conversation or an invitation to join in merriment. To do so would be considered incredibly insensitive, a profound breach of etiquette. The mourner, for their part, was expected to maintain a dignified reserve, to not engage in excessive displays of emotion in public, and to accept condolences with quiet grace. It was a silent agreement. Grief was a solitary burden, publicly acknowledged, but privately borne. One mainstream historical fact to highlight the specificities of mourning. The length and intensity of mourning periods varied significantly based on the deceased's relationship to the mourner. A widow, as mentioned, would wear deep mourning for over a year, followed by second mourning and half mourning, each with slightly less restrictive dress codes. Children mourning parents, or parents mourning children, also had prescribed periods. A distant cousin, however, might only observe a few weeks of lighter mourning. This intricate stratification ensured that every degree of relationship was publicly recognized and lamented appropriately, creating a complex web of grief that stretched across society. Now, for a quirky fringe tidbit that adds a touch of the macabre to this somber topic. Some particularly devoted mourners, especially widows, would commission mourning jewelry crafted from the hair of the deceased. Imagine wearing a delicate brooch or a ring with an intricately braided lock of your departed loved one's hair encased within it. This wasn't considered gruesome. It was a deeply personal and tangible way to keep the deceased close. While not directly about ignoring, it speaks to the intense, almost obsessive, relationship Victorians had with death and remembrance, a bond that sometimes extended to very physical, if slightly unsettling keepsakes. It's enough to send a quiet shiver down your spine, isn't it? And the gentle irony in all of this, a society that prized social connection and constant interaction, created an elaborate system that enforced social distance and isolation precisely at a time when individuals might have needed connection the most. The quiet acknowledgement of grief meant, paradoxically, a temporary withdrawal from the very fabric of society, a period of being respectfully ignored until the prescribed mourning period had gently faded away. It was a silent, sorrowful ballet, performed in shades of black and muted whispers. Having navigated the somber realm of mourning etiquette, we now transition to a more subtle, yet equally potent, arena of Victorian social strategy: letters and written communication. In an age before instant messages and frantic emojis, the written word held immense power. A letter wasn't just a means of conveying information. It was a carefully crafted artifact, a reflection of your education, your social standing, and your intentions. And within these elegantly penned missives lay hidden codes and subtle insults, capable of delivering a social cut as effectively as any averted gaze. Imagine you are seated at your writing desk, perhaps by a large bay window overlooking a bustling street. The scratch of your quill or the gentle glide of your newly fashionable fountain pen is the only sound. You are composing a letter, perhaps to an acquaintance or a distant relative. Every word choice, every flourish of your handwriting, every detail of the stationery itself conveyed a message beyond the literal text. A hurried hand or cheap paper might suggest a lack of respect or proper breeding. An overly ornate script or excessive length could imply a tiresome personality. It was a delicate balance, a literary tightrope walk. The art of ignoring, or rather, the art of being subtly dismissive, was perfectly executed through correspondence. A delayed reply, for instance, could be a profound slight. In an era where letters were often delivered multiple times a day in urban centers, a week-long silence spoke volumes. It implied you were not important enough to warrant a prompt response, that your communication was relegated to the bottom of the pile, beneath more pressing engagements. This passive-aggressive delay was a silent yet stinging form of dismissal. Or consider the brevity of a reply, a single, curt paragraph in response to a lengthy, effusive letter. It was the written equivalent of a raised eyebrow, a quiet suggestion that your enthusiasm was, perhaps a little much. Historians still argue whether the formality of Victorian correspondence encouraged intellectual rigor or simply masked genuine emotions. One particular quirky aspect of Victorian letter writing was the crossed letter, to save on postage, which was charged by the sheet. People would sometimes write their letter, then turn the page 90 degrees and write across their original text, creating a confusing, grid-like mess of words. Imagine trying to decipher a letter where sentences run vertically and horizontally, overlapping each other. It was a testament to frugality, but also a supreme test of the recipient's patience, and perhaps a subtle hint that you weren't quite important enough for a second sheet of paper. This wasn't a deliberate cut, perhaps, but certainly a gentle challenge to the reader's perseverance. A mainstream historical fact. The introduction of the penny post in 1840 revolutionized communication by making it affordable for everyone. Before this, postage was often expensive, paid by the recipient, and varied by distance and weight. The penny post, a uniform rate for a single sheet, led to an explosion in letter writing, making communication more accessible across social classes. This meant that the subtle codes and implied slights in letters became even more widespread, as everyone, from the humblest clerk to the grandest lady, was now engaged in the written social dance. Consider also the absence of an expected letter. If you had sent an invitation or inquired about someone's health and simply heard nothing back, that was perhaps the most brutal cut of all. No explanation, no excuse, just silence. It left you to ponder what transgression you had committed, what unspoken offense had led to your complete erasure from their correspondent's mind. It was a void of communication that spoke volumes, leaving the recipient in a gentle yet agonizing limbo of social uncertainty. The gentle humor in all of this, the sheer effort people put into being polite, even when they were delivering a social snub. It was a game of subtlety, where the sharpest insults were often delivered not with harsh words, but with careful omissions, delayed responses, or elegantly concise prose. It's enough to make you appreciate the simple directness of a modern-day read receipt, isn't it? At least you know where you stand, or rather, where your message has landed. From the silent battles fought on paper, we glide effortlessly into the glittering, yet equally treacherous, realm of the Victorian ballroom's silent language. This was no mere opportunity for light-hearted revelry. It was a carefully orchestrated social theater, where every step, every glance, and every refusal to dance held profound meaning. The dance floor, seemingly a space for joyous abandon, was, in fact, a silent arena for social display, negotiation, and, yes, the subtle art of the cut. Imagine you are a young lady, making your debut at a grand ball. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and wilting flowers. The sound of the orchestra swells, and hundreds of eyes, both hopeful and judgmental, sweep across the room. You stand, perhaps nervously, along the periphery, your dance card clutched in your gloved hand. This little card, a tiny booklet or fan-shaped item, was your social passport for the evening. Gentlemen would approach, request a dance, and sign their name next to a specific waltz or quadrille. Your social standing and desirability could often be measured by how quickly your card filled up. A nearly empty card was, well, a polite form of public humiliation. Here's where the art of ignoring became particularly exquisite. A gentleman might approach, eager to secure a dance. If, for whatever reason, you wished to politely decline, you couldn't simply say no. Oh, perish the thought. Such directness was unseemly. Instead, you might utter a vague excuse about already being engaged for that dance, even if your card was, in fact, suspiciously blank. Or, more subtly, you might simply avert your gaze slightly, focusing on an imaginary smudge on your glove, or a distant architectural detail, thereby failing to make eye contact as he approached. This was a gentle, almost imperceptible, yet devastating cut. The gentleman would understand the silent refusal and retreat, his ego bruised, but his public dignity intact. Historians still argue whether the elaborate dance rituals truly promoted chivalry or simply provided a highly ritualized platform for social maneuvering. Consider the intricate pantomime of the quadrille, a popular square dance. While performing its complex figures, you might find yourself momentarily facing someone with whom you had a recent social disagreement, or who had committed some minor offense. Instead of a warm smile or even a neutral expression, your face would remain perfectly impassive, your eyes perhaps fixed just beyond their shoulder. It was a silent conversation of non-acknowledgement, played out through structured movements, ensuring that even in close proximity, social distance was maintained. You danced with them, but you certainly didn't acknowledge them. One mainstream historical fact to illustrate the formality of the ballroom: gentlemen were expected to ask a lady's permission to dance, and ladies could only refuse a dance if they had already promised it to another, or if they were sitting out the entire dance. A direct refusal without a valid excuse was a grave insult, suggesting the gentleman was undesirable. This rule created a system where polite evasion was the primary tool for rejection, reinforcing the indirect communication prevalent in Victorian society. Now, for a quirky little tidbit that adds a touch of gentle awkwardness. It was considered improper for a lady to dance with the same gentleman more than 3 times in an evening. Any more than that, and tongues might start wagging, hinting at an improper attachment or an overly keen pursuit. Imagine the internal calculations. Oh dear, I've already danced with Mr. Fitzwilliam twice. One more, and my reputation might be slightly tarnished. This rule ensured a constant rotation of partners, preventing too much intimacy and encouraging wider social interaction, even if it meant politely turning down someone you genuinely enjoyed dancing with. It was a subtle, unwritten constraint on personal preference, all for the sake of appearances, and the quiet humor in all this. The immense amount of energy expended on appearing utterly effortless and charming, all while navigating a minefield of unspoken rules and subtle rejections. The ballroom, a place of supposed joy and connection, was often a stage for meticulously performed social distancing, where a polite refusal to dance could feel like a graceful, yet undeniably firm, push into social oblivion. Stepping out of the glittering, yet subtly judgmental ballroom, we now find ourselves strolling into the more expansive, yet equally surveilled, realm of public parks and the art of averted gazes. You might imagine a leisurely afternoon in Hyde Park, perhaps with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees and the distant clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages, a place for relaxation, quiet contemplation, or perhaps an innocent rendezvous. But in Victorian society, even a casual stroll through a public park was governed by a strict, unspoken code, especially when it came to who you acknowledged, and crucially, who you meticulously avoided acknowledging. Imagine you are enjoying a pleasant afternoon promenade. The sun is shining, the air is clean, and you are surrounded by a kaleidoscope of fashionable bonnets and top hats. You spot an acquaintance approaching from a distance. Now, your modern instinct might be to offer a warm smile, a friendly wave, or even a casual hello. But in the Victorian park, such spontaneity was often viewed with suspicion, or even as a social misstep. The rules of engagement were far more nuanced, designed to maintain decorum and subtle social stratification even in open spaces. The core of the averted gaze in public parks lay in the principle of not forcing an interaction. You see, if you initiated a greeting, you implicitly forced the other person to respond, which might be inconvenient or undesirable for them. Perhaps they were with someone they didn't wish to introduce you to, or perhaps they simply weren't in the mood for conversation. So, the polite thing to do was to give them the option. You would typically wait for the other person to initiate the greeting, especially if they were of higher social standing, or if you were a gentleman approaching a lady. If they offered a nod, a smile, or a verbal greeting, then you would respond in kind. If they didn't, you would simply allow your gaze to drift past them, as if utterly engrossed in a particularly fascinating cloud formation, or perhaps a rather stubborn patch of dandelions. This quiet act of non-recognition was a social grace, allowing both parties to avoid awkwardness. Historians still argue whether this pervasive avoidance cultivated a sense of personal space or merely reinforced social anxieties in public settings. Consider the gentle, almost imperceptible, choreography of these public encounters. You might see someone you know, but you're not quite sure if they're in a position to be acknowledged. So, you might offer a fleeting, almost hesitant glance, a silent inquiry. If they respond with even the slightest flicker of recognition, you can proceed with a polite nod. If they remain impassive, looking through you as if you were made of particularly transparent air, then you simply let your eyes continue their journey, as if you'd never intended to acknowledge them in the first place. It was a subtle negotiation, a game of social chicken, played out with only the briefest of eye contact. One mainstream historical fact to underscore the importance of public appearances: Victorian parks, like Hyde Park in London, were specifically designed as social venues where people could take the air, but also be seen and see others. They were crucial stages for displaying one's fashion, one's family, and one's social connections. The very act of being present in a fashionable park during popular hours was a social statement, and every interaction, or non-interaction, within it contributed to one's social narrative. Now for a quirky fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle absurdity. Some particularly shy or socially anxious Victorians were known to carry small, nondescript books, or even pocket-sized magnifying glasses with them on their strolls, specifically as props to justify an averted gaze. If they spotted someone they wished to avoid acknowledging, they could simply pretend to be deeply engrossed in their reading, or to be examining a particularly interesting leaf with intense scientific curiosity. It was a discreet, personal escape mechanism, allowing them to politely disappear from social view without actually having to run and hide behind a shrub. Imagine the quiet relief as you deftly pull out your miniature edition of Virgil, just as Mrs. Grundy approaches, ready to ask about your cousin's unfortunate engagement. It's enough to make you smile at the gentle ingenuity and the subtle humor in all this. the paradox of a society that built grand public spaces for people to gather, only to then devise an intricate system for them to politely ignore one another within those very spaces. The park, a symbol of freedom and openness, became another finely tuned instrument in the symphony of Victorian social control, where even a casual stroll was a performance in the delicate art of seeing and not seeing. From the tranquil yet subtly surveilled public parks, we now elevate our gaze, quite literally, to the highly theatrical setting of the opera box and its role as a social spectacle. In Victorian society, attending the opera wasn't just about enjoying the music. It was a paramount social event, a dazzling display of wealth, fashion, and, naturally, intricate social maneuvering. And within the confines of the private opera box, the art of quiet observation and deliberate non-acknowledgement reached a subtle crescendo. Imagine you are seated in your opera box, a plush, velvet-lined sanctuary perched above the main audience. The gaslights gleam, the chandeliers sparkle, and the distant murmur of the crowd fills the air before the overture begins. You are not merely a spectator to the performance on stage. You are, in effect, a performer yourself, subtly observing and being observed by the myriad occupants of the other boxes. Your posture, your attire, even the quiet flutter of your fan, all contributed to your public image. The opera box, for all its supposed privacy, was a very public stage. It was a place where social standing was subtly reinforced, where alliances were quietly displayed, and where social slights could be delivered with devastating precision. The act of cutting someone in this setting was an exquisite art form. You might spot an individual in an adjacent box with whom you had a recent disagreement, or perhaps someone whose social star had, in your estimation, begun to wane. Instead of a direct confrontation, you would simply not look. Your gaze would glide past their box, focusing intently on the stage, or perhaps on the intricate architectural details of the theater's ceiling. Your body language would convey a complete lack of awareness of their presence, even if you knew precisely where they were. It was a deliberate act of invisibility inflicted upon another. Historians still argue whether the popularity of opera boxes primarily served as cultural appreciation or as a key venue for elite social display and networking. Consider the gentle, almost imperceptible movements within the boxes. A slight turning of the shoulder, a prolonged focus through opera glasses on a distant point, a sudden, intense, whispered conversation with a companion. All these could be subtle signals of non-recognition. The person being ignored would feel the chill of the social snub. Perhaps a quiet knot forming in their stomach, but would be powerless to confront it directly. After all, how can you accuse someone of ignoring you if they have unexplicitly acknowledged your presence in the first place? It was a truly masterful form of passive aggression, played out under the shimmering glow of the footlights. One mainstream historical fact about opera etiquette: it was considered highly improper to arrive late to an opera performance, as it would cause a disturbance and draw undue attention. Even more so, leaving during an act was a major breach of decorum. This strict adherence to timing emphasized the seriousness of the social occasion and the importance of demonstrating respect for the performers and the audience, which was, in essence, the social elite observing each other. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that adds a touch of the absurd to this theatrical setting, some individuals, particularly those hoping to be noticed by specific influential people, would strategically position themselves at the very edge of their box, almost leaning out, attempting to catch the eye of someone across the theater. This was a risky maneuver. If successful, it could lead to a coveted acknowledgement. If unsuccessful, it could simply make them look overly eager, or worse, slightly ridiculous, resulting in polite, yet firm, averted gazes from those they were trying to impress. It was a social fishing expedition, conducted with the utmost discretion, often ending in a polite, yet silent, rejection. Imagine the gentle frustration as your carefully placed gaze fails to meet that of the Duke, who seems utterly captivated by the ceiling frescoes. It's enough to make you chuckle softly, and the subtle irony in all this opera, a celebration of dramatic human emotion, became a stage for its polite suppression. Inside the elegant boxes, a silent drama of social acceptance and rejection unfolded, where the most cutting remarks were made without a single spoken word, merely by the elegant turn of a head or the studied avoidance of a direct gaze. Having observed the silent battles within the exclusive opera box, we now descend into the very heart of the Victorian household, where even the most intimate spaces were governed by social codes, the role of servants as social barometers. In an era defined by rigid class distinctions, the presence and conduct of household staff were not merely a matter of practical utility. They were a profound reflection of the family's social standing, their adherence to etiquette, and crucially, their ability to subtly enforce social boundaries, including the art of ignoring. Imagine you are a guest arriving at a grand Victorian home. Your first point of contact wouldn't be the host or hostess. It would be the liveried footman, the stern-faced butler, or the demure housemaid who opened the door. These individuals, though in service, were the gatekeepers of the social realm, the first line of defense against unwelcome intrusions, and the first arbiters of your perceived social standing. Their demeanor, whether deferential, stiff, or subtly dismissive, communicated volumes about the household's expectations, and, indeed, about you. The servants were acutely aware of the social hierarchy, both within the house and amongst visitors. They were trained to recognize important guests, to differentiate between a casual caller and a genuinely desired visitor, and to execute the not-at-home charade with flawless precision. If you were deemed unwelcome, or if the lady of the house was simply not receiving, the servant would politely, yet firmly, convey this message. Their unwavering politeness in the face of your thwarted expectations was a gentle, yet undeniable, form of being ignored. You weren't being directly rejected by the mistress. You were being politely, almost invisibly, fended off by her loyal staff. Historians still argue whether the elaborate structure of Victorian household service was primarily about domestic efficiency or a crucial element of social stratification. Consider the subtle power dynamic at play. A well-trained butler, for instance, could, with a mere flick of his wrist or a barely perceptible shift in his gaze, communicate disapproval, impatience, or even a quiet judgment of a guest's perceived lack of breeding. They were the silent arbiters of taste and decorum, enforcing the unspoken rules of the house. You might feel a gentle prickle of unease if a servant seemed to look through you rather than at you, a subtle indication that you were not quite making the desired impression. One mainstream historical fact to underscore the sheer scale of domestic service. At the height of the Victorian era, domestic service was the largest single occupation for women in Britain. Millions were employed as maids, cooks, governesses, and more. This vast workforce was essential not just for running households, but for maintaining the social facade and intricate etiquette that defined the period. The presence of numerous well-trained servants was a clear indicator of a family's wealth and social prestige. Now for a quirky fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle mischief to the servant's role. It was not uncommon for servants to develop their own internal informal systems for rating guests, often based on their punctuality, their generosity with tips, or even their personal quirks. Imagine the quiet whispers in the servants' hall after a particularly demanding guest had departed, or the knowing glances exchanged over a poorly folded calling card. While they couldn't openly cut a guest, their collective opinion could influence the smooth running of the household, subtly affecting things like waiting times or the warmth of their reception on future visits. They were the silent, all-seeing eyes of the household, privy to all the social dramas unfolding. It's enough to make you wonder what secrets the silent butler of your imagination might be harboring, and the quiet humor in all of this. The elaborate charade maintained by both master and servant. The family presented an image of effortless grace and abundance, while the servants, often working tirelessly behind the scenes, subtly upheld that image, sometimes by politely, almost imperceptibly, nudging undesirable elements away. The Victorian home, for all its opulence, was a meticulously managed theater, and the servants were its unsung yet crucial stagehands, often performing the most delicate acts of social engineering, including the fine art of not seeing what they didn't wish to acknowledge. From the vigilant eyes of the household staff, we now shift our gaze to the subtle, yet utterly definitive, process known as the season's end and the ritual of social purging. In Victorian high society, the season, roughly April to July, was a whirlwind of balls, dinners, garden parties, and opera nights, a period of intense social activity where alliances were forged, marriages arranged, and reputations made or broken. But as the season drew to a close, a quieter, yet equally significant, ritual commenced: the subtle, annual process of shedding undesirable acquaintances, a kind of polite social cleansing that ensured one's inner circle remained perfectly polished. Imagine the gentle sighs of relief as the intense social schedule began to lighten. You might think it was simply a time for rest and retreat to the country. But for the socially astute, it was also a moment for quiet recalibration, for evaluating the multitude of new connections made during the season. Who had truly impressed? Who had proved to be a bore, a gossip, or worse, a social climber? This post-season assessment was crucial for maintaining the integrity and exclusivity of one's social sphere. The purging was rarely, if ever, explicit. You wouldn't send a polite letter informing someone they were no longer welcome in your social circle. Oh no, that would be appallingly vulgar. Instead, the art of ignoring became a highly refined tool. Invitations for future gatherings, whether in London or at country estates, would simply cease to arrive. Social calls, once reciprocated, would quietly fall away. If you encountered the purged individual at an incidental gathering, your gaze might politely, yet firmly, drift past them, as if they were a particularly uninteresting piece of decor. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible, fading away from one's social landscape. Historians still argue whether this annual social review was a necessary culling of undesirable elements, or merely a superficial exercise in maintaining elite exclusivity. Consider the gentle, persistent, cold shoulder. A person who had fallen out of favor wouldn't necessarily understand why. They would simply notice the increasing scarcity of invitations, the dwindling number of return calls, the subtle chill in previously warm interactions. This ambiguity was, for many, part of the torture. They would be left to ponder their perceived transgressions, to replay past conversations, searching for the fatal flaw that had led to their quiet exclusion. It was a ghosting, but with far more rigid and lasting consequences than today's fleeting digital disconnections. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the importance of the season. The London social season was fundamentally designed as a marriage market for the aristocratic and wealthy classes. Daughters were brought out and presented at court with the express purpose of finding a suitable husband. Therefore, the strategic forging and breaking of social ties during and after the season were often directly linked to securing advantageous marital alliances. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that highlights the subtle cruelty of this purging. Some particularly catty hostesses were known to subtly forget to include certain names on their guest lists for their smaller, more exclusive autumn gatherings, while ostentatiously inviting others who were on the social bubble. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, silent signal that a particular individual was no longer considered part of the inner sanctum. Imagine receiving an invitation to a charming country house party, only to realize that a friend you thought was firmly ensconced in the same circle had been conspicuously omitted. It was a quiet declaration of social warfare, fought with embossed invitations and careful omissions. It's enough to make you shiver, imagining the subtle anxieties of being on the wrong side of such a forgotten invitation. And the gentle humor in all this, the sheer effort involved in maintaining an appearance of effortless grace, even as one was quietly, meticulously pruning one's social garden. The end of the season, far from being a time of simple rest, was a strategic period of quiet social maintenance, ensuring that only the most desirable blooms remained in one's perfectly cultivated social bouquet. From the subtle culling of the social season, we now journey to the vast, unpredictable expanses of Victorian travel and the art of averted encounters. While the Grand Tour was a purposeful expedition, ordinary travel, by train, ship, or even carriage, presented its own unique set of social challenges. Away from the structured environments of London drawing rooms or established social gatherings, maintaining proper etiquette and especially avoiding unwanted interactions required a fresh set of subtle maneuvers. Imagine you are aboard a rather crowded train carriage, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a soothing backdrop to the gentle sway. You're on your way to visit a relative in the countryside, perhaps. Suddenly, you spot someone from your past, someone you'd rather not engage with, perhaps a business rival, a distant cousin with a tiresome habit of borrowing money, or even someone who committed a minor social infraction at a past dinner party. In the enclosed space of a train carriage or the shared deck of a steamer, a direct cut, like simply walking away, wasn't always feasible. This is where the ingenuity of the Victorian traveler came into play. One common strategy was to become instantly, profoundly absorbed in a book or newspaper. You would raise the paper to a strategic height, creating a polite, yet impenetrable barrier between yourself and the approaching undesirable. Your eyes would scan the columns with exaggerated intensity, your brow furrowed in feigned concentration, effectively making yourself invisible. Or, if a book was your chosen shield, you might simply stare fixedly at a page, even if you weren't truly reading a word, hoping to convey that you were utterly unreachable. It was a silent declaration of "I am not here for social interaction. Thank you very much." Historians still argue whether the challenges of travel during this period fostered greater personal resilience or merely exacerbated social anxieties. Consider the polite discomfort of a prolonged journey. You might find yourself in a compartment with someone you knew, but with whom you had little to say. The unspoken rule was to maintain a respectful silence, to avoid forcing conversation where none was desired. Perhaps you would gaze out the window at the passing landscape, lost in contemplation, or simply close your eyes and pretend to doze off. Any active attempt to engage someone who was clearly signaling a desire for solitude would be considered rude, a breach of the unspoken contract of shared public space. One mainstream historical fact to illustrate the changing nature of travel. The expansion of the railway network across Britain revolutionized travel, making it faster and more accessible to a wider range of social classes. This meant that encounters with people from different social strata became more common in public conveyances, necessitating even more nuanced strategies for polite avoidance and the maintenance of social boundaries. The train carriage, once a luxury, became a melting pot, demanding new forms of social management. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle theatricality to travel avoidance, some travelers were known to carry small, collapsible screens or portable privacy shades, particularly for use in train compartments or on ship decks. These weren't elaborate, but enough to create a subtle visual barrier, indicating a desire for personal space and effectively making one unapproachable for casual conversation. Imagine unfolding a delicate, patterned screen between yourself and a boar. A silent declaration of "Please, do not disturb my contemplation of the English countryside." It was a physical manifestation of the desire to be ignored, a polite wall constructed on the go. It's enough to make you chuckle softly at the lengths people would go for a moment of peace. And the gentle irony in all this, that even when individuals embarked on journeys seeking adventure or escape, they carried with them the intricate web of Victorian social rules. The wide-open world outside the drawing room was still subject to the subtle dictates of decorum, and the art of polite avoidance remained a crucial skill even amidst the rattling and jostling of a train ride. Having journeyed through the social landscapes of Victorian travel, we now arrive at a fascinating, almost paradoxical aspect of Victorian society: the realm of eccentricities and social exceptions. While the overarching narrative of the era is one of rigid conformity and strict etiquette, there were always individuals who, through sheer force of personality, immense wealth, or simply a delightful disregard for convention, managed to defy the rules without suffering immediate social ostracism. These were the true outliers, the charmingly peculiar figures who, in a world where not acknowledging someone could be a death sentence, somehow managed to be forgiven for their delightful deviations. Imagine you are at a society garden party, and amidst the perfectly coiffed ladies and impeccably suited gentlemen, you spot him, the notoriously eccentric Lord Bumble, perhaps wearing mismatched socks, carrying a pet ferret on his shoulder, or insisting on addressing everyone by a peculiar, invented nickname. By all accounts of Victorian etiquette, such behavior should lead to immediate social exile, a cascade of polite snubs and averted gazes. Yet, Lord Bumble is not only tolerated, but often quietly admired for his quirks. Why? Because his eccentricity is so profound, so utterly unconcerned with societal judgment, that it becomes, in itself, a form of social power. He doesn't conform, and therefore, the rules simply don't seem to apply to him in the same way. He is, in a sense, above the fray, gently ignoring the rules that bind everyone else. This phenomenon of the social exception often rested on a delicate balance. The eccentric individual usually possessed immense wealth, an unassailable aristocratic lineage, or a genuine, albeit peculiar, talent that made their presence desirable. If you were truly rich enough, or your family tree went back far enough, you could get away with a surprising amount of odd behavior. Your peculiar habits became charming quirks rather than vulgar transgressions. It was a subtle acknowledgement that while the rules were for most people, a select few could operate outside their rigid framework, receiving polite, yet firm, social cuts from no one. Historians still argue whether these eccentric figures genuinely challenged social norms, or merely reinforced the power of the elite to dictate acceptable behavior. Consider the gentle amusement, perhaps even envy, with which these eccentrics were viewed. While others were agonizing over the precise angle of their hat, or the correct number of calling cards to leave, these individuals simply didn't care. They spoke their minds, wore what they pleased, and pursued their unusual hobbies without a thought for social approval. For a society so tightly bound by decorum, there was a certain fascination with those who effortlessly floated above it all. You might see a renowned explorer, famous for his daring expeditions, publicly dining alone while murmuring to himself, and instead of being socially shunned, he would be quietly observed with a mix of awe and gentle pity. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the existence of such figures. The Victorian era produced a number of well-documented eccentrics, whose unusual habits were often chronicled in society columns and popular anecdotes. Figures like Mad Jack Mitten, known for his outrageous stunts and extravagant lifestyle, or even certain reclusive scholars who pursued their studies with obsessive zeal, became legendary precisely because they defied typical societal expectations. They were the living proof that the strictures of etiquette, while powerful, were not entirely inescapable for everyone. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that speaks to the gentle absurdity of these exceptions, some genuine eccentrics would develop highly specific, almost ritualistic routines that, if followed by anyone else, would be seen as utterly preposterous. Imagine a wealthy gentleman who insisted on walking his pet tortoise on a leash through the most fashionable parts of London every Tuesday afternoon, pausing precisely at 3 p.m. to read poetry aloud to it. While initially met with polite bewilderment, this consistent, harmless oddity would eventually become part of his accepted persona, a delightful, almost expected, deviation from the norm. It was a bizarre yet comforting anchor in a sea of rigid conformity. It's enough to make you smile, picturing such a scene unfolding amidst the otherwise prim and proper Victorian streetscape, and the subtle humor in all this. That a society so dedicated to controlling public behavior also harbored a quiet admiration for those who, through sheer will or privilege, managed to escape its most stringent demands. The eccentric Victorian was a living contradiction, a charming testament to the idea that even in a world obsessed with propriety, there was always room for a little glorious, gentle oddity and a quiet, unspoken agreement to not apply the usual rules of social interaction. From the delightful oddities of Victorian eccentrics, we now leap forward in time, though still within the Victorian span, to consider a disruptive force that began to gently unravel the meticulous tapestry of social etiquette, the rise of the telephone, and its immediate impact on social chaos. Imagine a world where every social interaction was carefully planned, every visit announced, every conversation measured. Then, suddenly, a new invention arrives, promising instant communication, an unheard-of immediacy that completely bypassed the familiar rituals of calling cards, formal introductions, and strategic avoidance. Imagine you are a Victorian lady, perhaps still reeling from the complexities of the last dinner party. Suddenly, a strange device in your home rings. This is not the familiar chime of the doorbell, announcing a formal caller. This is an insistent, almost rude, mechanical sound. You pick up the receiver, a curious, trumpet-like object, and a voice, disembodied and startlingly direct, speaks to you. There's no footman to announce the caller, no calling card to assess their social standing, no opportunity for a polite "not at home." The telephone cut through all of it, like a rather blunt knife through a perfectly prepared. The very nature of telephone communication was inherently informal. It encouraged direct, spontaneous conversation, shattering the carefully constructed barriers of Victorian social interaction. How could you politely ignore someone if they were speaking directly into your ear? How could you execute a subtle social cut when there was no visual cue to avert your gaze? The telephone presented a dilemma. Its convenience was undeniable, but its disregard for established social protocols was deeply unsettling to many. Historians still argue whether the telephone primarily facilitated communication or inadvertently accelerated the erosion of traditional social formalities. Consider the gentle horror of a social inferior calling you directly, unannounced, unvetted. Prior to the telephone, such an individual would have had to navigate a series of gatekeepers, your servants, your carefully scheduled at-home days, allowing you ample opportunity for polite evasion. Now, they could simply dial your number. This forced a directness that many found deeply uncomfortable, demanding an immediate response, where previously a delayed letter or a polite refusal via a servant would have sufficed. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift, but one that subtly democratized access and challenged the rigid social hierarchy. One mainstream historical fact to underscore the novelty of this invention. The first telephone exchange in London opened in 1879, and by the end of the century, telephones were becoming increasingly common in wealthier homes and businesses. This rapid adoption, while initially limited to the upper echelons, quickly demonstrated its potential to bypass the traditional channels of social communication, creating both excitement and a quiet sense of apprehension about its societal implications. Now for a quirky fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle chaos to the early days of telephony. In some very early exchanges, before proper switchboards and operators were widespread, callers might literally yell into the mouthpiece, hoping to be heard by someone on the other end of the line, or even by an operator who was essentially listening to a multitude of conversations at once. Imagine the noise, the potential for eavesdropping, and the complete lack of privacy. It was a far cry from the serene, controlled environment of a drawing room call. This chaotic nature only added to the feeling among some traditionalists that the telephone was a rather vulgar intrusion into polite society. It's enough to make you smile at the thought of a Victorian lady shouting her social inquiries into a primitive telephone, and the subtle humor in all this. The sheer bewilderment of a society trying to apply centuries of elaborate etiquette to an invention that fundamentally defied it. The telephone, with its insistence on directness and immediacy, forced Victorians to confront a new reality where the art of polite social avoidance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. It was a gentle, yet persistent, ring of change in a world that preferred its social interactions meticulously curated and subtly controlled. Having witnessed the quiet upheaval brought about by the telephone, we now shift our attention to a more intimate, yet equally regulated, sphere of Victorian life: medical etiquette and the doctor's visit. In an era where health was often precarious and medical science was still developing rapidly, the relationship between patient and physician was far from a casual affair. It was governed by its own set of elaborate rules, often mirroring the broader social hierarchies, and including subtle forms of interaction and avoidance that might seem peculiar to us today. Imagine you are feeling rather poorly, perhaps suffering from a persistent cough or a touch of the vapors. You wouldn't simply pop into a doctor's office, as you might today. Instead, you would send a message, often a handwritten note, requesting the doctor's presence. Or, if you were of lower means, perhaps a family member would go to his surgery. The doctor, being a professional, held a position of respect, but also operated within the strictures of class. His visits were often timed and formal, and your interaction with him, even concerning the most private of ailments, was expected to remain within polite bounds. The art of polite avoidance, or rather, the careful management of information, was crucial here. Patients were expected to be decorous, even when discussing embarrassing symptoms. There was a delicate balance between providing enough information for a diagnosis and maintaining a sense of propriety. Doctors, for their part, often employed a formal, almost detached demeanor, designed to project authority and professionalism, but also to maintain a certain distance, both personal and emotional. This wasn't about being rude. It was about upholding the sanctity of the professional relationship and the unspoken boundaries of social interaction. Historians still argue whether this formality in medical consultations instilled confidence in patients or created barriers to open communication about sensitive health matters. Consider the role of the companion during a doctor's visit. For ladies, it was often considered improper to be alone with a male physician, particularly if the examination involved any degree of physical contact. A chaperone, often an older female relative or a trusted servant, would be present. This presence, while ostensibly for propriety, also served as a subtle form of social control, ensuring that neither the patient nor the doctor overstepped their boundaries. The chaperone's quiet observation was a constant, gentle reminder of the prevailing social expectations. Even in the privacy of a secret, you might find yourself discussing your delicate constitution with the doctor, all while your Aunt Mildred sat sternly knitting in the corner, her presence a silent testament to Victorian decorum. One mainstream historical fact to emphasize the era's medical context: Victorian medicine was a transitional period, moving from traditional remedies and humoral theory towards more scientific understanding, particularly with the advent of germ theory later in the century. This meant that patients often encountered a mix of empirical observation, evolving scientific knowledge, and sometimes rather questionable treatments, making trust and decorum in the doctor-patient relationship even more vital. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle awkwardness to the medical consultation. Some Victorian physicians, particularly those treating more delicate female patients, would avoid direct questioning about sensitive symptoms. Instead, they might rely on coded language, or even ask questions indirectly through the chaperone to spare the lady's blushes. Imagine having to describe your symptoms to your aunt, who then relayed them, perhaps with her own gentle embellishments, to the doctor, who then offered a diagnosis back through the aunt. It was a convoluted, yet surprisingly common, dance of politeness and indirect communication, all to avoid any perceived impropriety. It's enough to make you smile at the lengths they went to for modesty, even when health was at stake. And the subtle humor in all of this, the meticulous effort to maintain formality and decorum, even when discussing the most intimate and vulnerable aspects of human existence. The Victorian Dr.'s visit was a gentle paradox, a private consultation performed with a very public set of unspoken rules, ensuring that even in sickness, the rigid boundaries of social interaction remained firmly, if politely, in place. From the hushed formality of the doctor's visit, we now turn our attention to the very guidebooks that sought to illuminate this complex social landscape. Etiquette manuals, their role as guides or gags, and their often humorous, if unintentional, outcomes. In a society obsessed with propriety and obsessed with the correct way to do everything, it's no surprise that a veritable publishing industry grew around telling people precisely how to behave. These books promised to transform the socially awkward into paragons of politeness, offering meticulous instructions on everything from bowing correctly to the appropriate length of a morning call. Imagine yourself, perhaps a hopeful social climber, poring over a thick volume titled Hints on Etiquette for the Use of Society at Large, and Young Men in particular. You're desperately trying to decipher the nuances of acknowledging an acquaintance in the street, or the precise timing for a dinner invitation. These manuals were prescriptive, leaving little room for individual interpretation. They were the rulebooks for the grand social game, attempting to codify every conceivable interaction and prevent any potential faux pas. They were, in essence, trying to take the guesswork out of social life, replacing it with a comforting, if overwhelming, certainty. Historians still argue whether these manuals were genuinely effective in shaping behavior or merely reflected an idealized vision of Victorian society. The humor, often unintentional, lay in their meticulous detail and their sometimes absurdly specific pronouncements. One might find advice on how to gracefully decline a proposal of marriage, or the exact manner in which to leave a lady's presence if she happened to yawn while you were speaking. The sheer earnestness with which these trivialities were presented can elicit a gentle chuckle. Imagine the serious tone in which a manual might advise you to never point with your knife at the dinner table, as if this simple act could unleash social Armageddon. It was a world where a misplaced crumb or an unreturned bow could be treated with the gravity usually reserved for matters of state. Consider the anxiety these manuals must have inadvertently caused. If every single interaction had a correct way and 1,000 incorrect ways, how could one ever relax? The very act of trying to adhere to every rule could lead to a stiff, unnatural demeanor, ironically making one appear more awkward rather than less. You might find yourself so preoccupied with remembering whether to offer your left hand or your right when shaking hands that you completely forgot to engage in actual conversation. The manuals promised social ease, but often delivered a quiet, internal panic. One mainstream historical fact about these publications: Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in installments in 1859-1861, became one of the most famous and influential of these guides, covering not just etiquette, but also cooking, household chores, and childcare. Its immense popularity shows the widespread desire for guidance in navigating the complexities of Victorian domestic and social life. It was a one-stop shop for aspiring middle-class Victorians seeking to emulate the genteel ways of the aristocracy. Now, for a quirky fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle defiance. Despite the strictures of these manuals, real life, as always, found ways to deviate. There were always those who, consciously or unconsciously, ignored certain rules, either because they found them ridiculous, or simply because they were too busy living their lives. Imagine a robust country gentleman who, despite reading his etiquette manual, still insisted on hearty backslapping rather than a formal handshake, much to the quiet consternation of his more refined London acquaintances. These small acts of rebellion, though rarely openly challenged, offered a subtle counter-narrative to the manual's rigid prescriptions. It's enough to make you smile, picturing the quiet battles between printed rule and lived reality, and the gentle humor in all of this. The paradox of creating books to teach effortless grace. The etiquette manuals, for all their earnest intent, often highlight the underlying social anxieties and the deep human need to belong, even if it meant memorizing hundreds of seemingly arbitrary rules. They were a testament to a society trying its best to maintain order and predictability, even as the world around it was slowly, gently, moving towards a less formal future. From the earnest, sometimes amusing, pages of etiquette manuals, we finally arrive at a moment of gentle reflection: the legacy of Victorian snubs, and how these old rules subtly persist in modern social interactions. While we no longer carry calling cards or meticulously plan our averted gazes in public parks, the echoes of Victorian decorum, and particularly the art of polite non-acknowledgement, can still be found whispering in the corners of our contemporary lives. Imagine, if you will, the ubiquitous nature of your smartphone. You're at a coffee shop, or perhaps on a bus. You spot someone you know, but you're not in the mood for a chat. What do? You likely instinctively reach for your phone, burying your face in its glowing screen, feigning intense concentration on an email, a social media feed, or even a blank notes app. This is our modern equivalent of the Victorian averted gaze, isn't it? A polite, yet firm signal that you are currently unavailable for social engagement. We don't have to carry a small, decorative book. Our phones serve as perfectly acceptable and universally understood social shields. Historians still argue whether our current digital social behaviors are a regression to Victorian formality or a new evolution of human interaction. Consider the subtle art of ghosting, a term now widely used in dating and professional circles. When someone simply stops replying to your messages, disappears from group chats, or fails to acknowledge your attempts at contact without explanation, that's a direct descendant of the Victorian cut. It's the silent withdrawal, the unacknowledged presence, leaving the recipient in a familiar state of bewildered uncertainty. No dramatic breakup, no formal dismissal, just a quiet, painful fading away. The method has changed, from calling card to WhatsApp message, but the emotional impact, the feeling of being erased, remains remarkably similar. One mainstream historical fact that links our past to our present, the desire for social order and the subtle communication of boundaries, are fundamental aspects of human interaction across all eras. While the specific rituals change, the underlying human need to categorize, to accept, and to reject remains constant. Victorian etiquette, for all its specific rules, was simply a highly formalized expression of these enduring social dynamics. Now, for a quirky, fringe tidbit that adds a touch of gentle irony. Think about the polite smile and wave you might give to a distant acquaintance, knowing full well you have no intention of stopping for a conversation. This fleeting acknowledgement, just enough to avoid being rude but not enough to invite engagement, is a direct echo of the Victorians' brief, almost imperceptible glance before their gaze politely drifted away. We've streamlined the process, perhaps, but the core intent to acknowledge, without committing, is strikingly similar. It's enough to make you smile at how stubbornly human nature clings to its polite evasions, and the gentle humor in all of this, that for all our modern freedoms and our rejection of rigid formalities, we still find ourselves devising new, technologically advanced ways to politely ignore each other. The Victorians, with their elaborate social ballet, might have been slower and perhaps more charmingly analog, but their fundamental social anxieties and their ingenious methods of managing unwanted interaction still resonate softly in our digital age.